You probably know Coney Island as the place with the boardwalk, the hot dogs, and a roller coaster that refuses to die. But before all of that became normal, there was Luna Park, a place so bizarre, so spectacular, and so morally questionable in ways that would make your jaw drop today that people genuinely couldn't believe it was real. And today, we are going through the dark history of Coney Island's Luna Park, the two guys who built a fantasy out of spite. Before Thompson and Dundee showed up, Coney Island already had a reputation, and not entirely a flattering one. Through much of the 19th century, the peninsula at the southern tip of Brooklyn had been home to a loose collection of bathhouses, saloons, beer gardens, gambling halls, and establishments that newspapers called, with only slight exaggeration, morally questionable. The nickname that stuck from those years was Sodom by the Sea. It was not meant as a compliment. By the 1870s, serious money had arrived. Hotels went up. A more refined crowd tried to establish Coney Island as a respectable resort. That worked for a while, until the refined crowd discovered that the same train bringing them to the beach was also bringing everyone else, and the whole project of Coney Island as a genteel retreat gradually collapsed into something rowdier and more egalitarian. Steeplechase Park, which opened in 1897 under George Tillieu, was the first attempt to formalize the chaos, to put a fence around a collection of rides, charge admission, and call it an experience. It worked well enough that by 1901, Tillieu was looking everywhere he could for new attractions to keep his audience coming back. The story of Luna Park begins, appropriately, with a coin flip gone wrong and two men with oversized egos deciding to build the most outrageous place on earth just to prove a point. Frederick Thompson was a 20-something architect from Ohio with a flair for spectacle and almost no impulse control when it came to money. Elmer "Skip" Dundee was his business partner, the one who handled the finances, which, as it turned out, was like hiring a fire extinguisher for a building that was already on fire. But together, they were electric. In 1901, Thompson designed a ride called A Trip to the Moon for the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Visitors boarded a fantastical winged airship called Luna, complete with flapping mechanical wings, simulated rocking, and changing backdrops showing the Earth shrinking below them, and were whisked to the moon, where they disembarked onto a papier-mâché lunar landscape populated by oddly costumed dwarfs posing as moon people. This was 1901. Airplanes wouldn't exist for 2 more years. The Wright brothers hadn't yet had their moment at Kitty Hawk. The fact that Thompson built a moon ride before powered flight existed says everything you need to know about him. The ride was a monster hit. George Tillieu, the owner of Steeplechase Park on Coney Island, already the most famous amusement park in the country at the time, invited Thompson and Dundee to bring the attraction to his park for the 1902 season. They agreed, and then Tillieu, because apparently he couldn't help himself, offered them a new contract the following year weighted heavily in his favor. When they balked and walked out, the conversation reportedly ended with Thompson and Dundee telling Tillieu they would build a park that would put Steeplechase out of business. Great way to make friends. They approached Paul Boynton, who owned the struggling Sea Lion Park next door, and arranged a long-term lease on his 16 acres. They also picked up the adjacent plot where the Elephantine Colossus Hotel had stood before burning down in 1896, getting them 22 acres total to work with. Then they raised what they advertised as $1 million. They actually spent around $700,000 and got to work. On the day they opened, Thompson and Dundee reportedly had $12 between them and had to borrow suits from their valet, who had gone an entire winter without pay just because he believed in them. At 8 p.m. on May 16, 1903, they threw the switch. 250,000 electric lights blazed into the night sky, illuminating a skyline of over 1,000 spires, towers, minarets, and domes that looked like an oriental palace dreamed up by someone who had never actually been to the Orient. Within 2 hours, 60,000 people had poured through the gates, each paying 10 cents just to get in. The following night, the power went out briefly, and the crowds of 60,000 made a panicked rush for the exits, with pickpockets reportedly working the chaos on Surf Avenue outside. Thompson and Dundee had the lights back on within 30 minutes and kept going. By July 4th, a single day that drew 142,332 paying visitors, Thompson and Dundee had paid back every cent they had borrowed. They expanded for the following season, adding 16 acres to bring the park to 38 total. Notable figures visited in those early years: Thomas Edison came, Secretary of War Elijah Root came. The park appeared in Roscoe Arbuckle's 1917 film Coney Island, and later in the 1928 Oscar-nominated film The Crowd by director King Vidor. 4 months after opening, a Harper's Weekly writer was still struggling to describe what Thompson had pulled off. He wrote that 2 young men from the West had, without any announcement, erected an amusement park that had no counterpart anywhere else on Earth. That was quite a debut. Before the park even opened, they killed an elephant. Here is where things get dark early, and we mean before Luna Park officially opened to the public. During the construction of the park in late 1902, Thompson and Dundee found themselves in possession of an elephant. Her name was Topsy. She was a female Asian elephant who had spent about 25 years in the four-paw circus, 3 decades in which, it should be said, she was frequently abused by her handler, a man named William Whitey Alt, who used to arrive for work extremely drunk and once stabbed her with a pitchfork when she refused to haul equipment. Topsy, understandably, had a temper. By 1902, she had a reputation as a bad elephant, a label applied to her after she killed 3 men, at least one of whom had tried to feed her a lit cigarette. She was declared a danger to the public, and Thompson and Dundee, never ones to let an opportunity go to waste, saw in her a publicity stunt of spectacular proportions. First, they announced they would hang her publicly and sell tickets. The ASPCA intervened. "Fine," said Thompson and Dundee, "electrocution it is. More humane and better for the papers anyway." On January 4th, 1903, 4 months before Luna Park opened, in front of a crowd of invited reporters and guests, Topsy was first fed carrots laced with 460 grams of potassium cyanide. Workers then fitted copper sandals to her feet, strung power lines 9 blocks from a local substation, and sent 6,600 volts through her body for 10 seconds. She shuddered, smoke rose from her hide, and she toppled over, dead. A film crew from the Edison Manufacturing Company recorded the entire thing. The 74-second film, electrocuting an elephant, was released to coin-operated kinetoscopes across America 13 days later and became, in a thoroughly depressing first, arguably the first film death ever widely distributed to the public. Over the following century, the story got tangled up in a popular myth that Thomas Edison personally killed Topsy as a stunt in his ongoing competition with Nikola Tesla and Westinghouse. This is false. Edison was not at Luna Park. The current wars had ended over a decade before, in 1892. The electric power was supplied by the Brooklyn Edison Illuminating Company, a local company that used the Edison name under license, but had no direct connection to the man himself. Edison's film company shot the footage, but there is no evidence Edison ordered or even knew about the filming. The actual villains in this story were Thompson and Dundee, who had an elephant they didn't want, a park opening to promote, and absolutely zero reservations about killing one to serve the other. After Topsy died, workers performed an autopsy right there in the park. Thompson reportedly kept part of her hide stretched over his office chair. He did. We are not making that up. What Luna Park actually was at its peak. Before we get further into the darkness, it is worth pausing for a moment to describe what Luna Park was at its height, because without that picture, the rest of the story loses some of its weight. The park, at full operation, covered 38 acres and had over 1,000 individual towers, spires, and domes lit from below by electric light. The central feature was a 200-foot electric tower, visible for miles across Brooklyn on a clear night, decorated with 20,000 incandescent bulbs of its own. The heart-shaped lagoon at the park's center had boats sliding down the Chute-the-Chute's water flume on one end and the blazing tower on the other. The roller coasters were serious machines. The Dragon's Gorge was an indoor scenic railway, a covered coaster that sent riders plunging through reproductions of canyons, glaciers, and the Grand Canal, while the architecture created an impression of genuine geography. In 1924, the Mile Sky Racer arrived, a coaster that ran for nearly half the park's perimeter, with drops of more than 70 feet, and was, at the time, the biggest and longest ride at Coney Island. A Trip to the Moon continued to run for years and drew over 400,000 riders in its first season alone. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea followed, a submarine simulation that was replaced in 1905 by the Dragon's Gorge, because Thompson, constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone, always needed something new. There was a great naval spectatorium recreating naval battles with real water effects, a ballroom, circus performances, animal shows with camels and elephants walking freely through the concourses, and an event called Fire and Flames, which is exactly what it sounds like and which we'll get to shortly. At its 1904 peak, attendance on a single summer weekend could reach 140,000 people. To put that in context, that is more people than attend most modern NFL games, all of them arriving by streetcar and foot to stand in 22 acres of electric light, fire, flames, and the business of disaster. Luna Park had a specific type of show that said a great deal about its era and its audience. It was called Fire and Flames, and it debuted in 1904. The premise was exactly what it sounds like. A full 4-story building was constructed inside the park. Each performance, the building would dramatically catch fire, complete with actual flames, and a company of hired firefighters would respond to rescue trapped actors and actresses. Crowds packed in to watch the building burn, and the performers leap from windows into safety nets below. The show ran for years. Audiences loved it. At its peak, it reportedly employed around 50 actors and real firefighters, and the level of production detail was serious enough to feel genuinely terrifying. Thompson, who understood his audience better than almost anyone, had correctly identified that people wanted to experience danger without any actual risk. The show was so successful that the neighboring Dreamland Park, which opened in 1904 and spent most of its existence desperately trying to out-spectacle Luna, built their own version called Fighting Flames, which was supposedly even more elaborate. This competitive relationship between Luna and Dreamland was one of the most entertainingly petty rivalries in amusement park history. Dreamland's founder, William Reynolds, essentially built his entire park as a direct response to Luna's success, copying ride concepts, poaching acts, and advertising his electric tower as bigger and his ballroom as grander. At one point, Dreamland secretly approached Luna's Filipino performers with promises of better pay and lured them away mid-season, reportedly causing Thompson and Dundee to erupt in fury and then issue a statement claiming they had closed the exhibit voluntarily because they didn't want to exploit the Bontoc people. This was transparently ridiculous. They had been plenty comfortable exploiting them up until the moment a competitor offered more money. Speaking of which, the human zoo. In 1905, Luna Park had what management considered one of their most popular attractions of the season. 50 members of the Bontoc Igorot people, brought from the northern Philippines by an American showman named Truman Hunt, were placed inside a bamboo fenced enclosure where paying visitors could watch them perform staged tribal rituals. Hunt had persuaded the Bontoc people to make the trip by promising them $15 a month and a return home within a year. He also, because he had the ethics of a parking enforcement officer, began systematically withholding their wages the moment they were profitable. Hunt had previously served as lieutenant governor of Bontoc province in the Philippines, following the Spanish-American War, which was how he had established a relationship with the community in the first place. He took that trust and turned it directly into a business proposition. Back home, the U.S. government had already spent $1.5 million in 1904 taking over 1,300 Filipinos from various tribes to the St. Louis World's Fair as a kind of imperial exhibition. So Hunt was operating in a context where this was considered, if not admirable, at least normal. The press described the exhibit with the full enthusiasm and complete lack of self-awareness of the era. Papers advertised the Bontoc as fearsome headhunters and dog-eaters, customs that did exist in their culture, but were stripped entirely of context and performed on command for American crowds. Crowd-pleasing dog feasts were staged so often that Hunt had to order fresh dogs from the New York City Pound to keep up with the performance schedule. According to the Coney Island Museum, the exhibit enforced a racial interpretation of hierarchy, expansion, and exclusion. Luna Park, meanwhile, was considered an exemplary family amusement park of its time. The Igorot exhibit was such a hit that summer that Dreamland paid to steal it for the following season, the same episode that caused Thompson and Dundee to claim their sudden, implausible humanitarian concern for the very people they had been charging admission to stare at. The U.S. government eventually sent an agent to investigate Truman Hunt for withholding wages and mistreating the Bontoc people. Hunt, tipped off, fled with the group on a months-long tour across more than 50 American cities, pursued by creditors, the government agent, and Pinkerton detectives. He was eventually arrested and prosecuted. The Bontoc people were finally returned to the Philippines in 1906, more than a year after they had been promised they would go home. The baby sideshow that was also somehow medicine. Here is a story that is genuinely harder to categorize than anything else about Luna Park. From the very first season, in 1903 through to 1943, Luna Park housed a sideshow called Incubator Babies. Run by a French-born physician named Dr. Martin Coney, the exhibit displayed premature newborns living in glass-fronted incubators, tended by nurses in full uniform, while paying visitors walked past and peered in at infants who weighed as little as 2 pounds. Barkers outside the exhibit beckoned passers-by to come see the tiny babies, and in the early years, one of those barkers was a young Archibald Leach, who would later be known to the world as Cary Grant. The exhibit sounds appalling when described that way, and it was, in some important respects, deeply strange. But the medical reality was equally strange. In the early 1900s, incubator technology was so new and so poorly understood that American hospitals largely refused to adopt it. Dr. Coney had seen the incubators at the 1896 Berlin Exposition and become convinced they could save premature infants who would otherwise die within days of birth. Unable to get hospitals to take them seriously, he did what any reasonable turn-of-the-century physician with a flair for showmanship would do. He set up an incubator exhibition on the Coney Island boardwalk and charged the public to fund it. He never charged parents a cent. Across 40 years of operation, An estimated 8,000 premature babies passed through his exhibits at Coney Island, and at least 6,500 of them survived. Medical historian Jeffrey Baker has noted that County's exhibits offered a standard of technological care not matched in any hospital of the time. The exhibit ran on the same boardwalk as sword swallowers and bearded ladies, and it saved thousands of lives. One of County's former patients, Lucille Horn, born in 1920 at under 2 pounds and given no chance to survive by her doctor, described it plainly in an interview years later. "My parents knew about the incubator baby sideshow in Coney Island and were reluctant to send me there. Dr. Coney came to the hospital and spoke to my mother, and she agreed to put me under his care." She was 95 years old when she gave that interview. Luna Park somehow contained on the same grounds a human zoo, a staged elephant execution, and the most advanced neonatal care in the United States. That is some range. The men behind it fall apart. Thompson and Dundee's partnership was the engine that drove Luna Park's greatest years. When the engine broke down, the park never really recovered. Elmer Dundee died in November 1907 at just 40 years old. He had handled the money, not always well, but with enough competence to keep Thompson's appetite for spectacle from burning everything down immediately. Without Dundee, Thompson's drinking worsened, his personal spending escalated, and his marriage fell apart. His first wife divorced him in 1911. He remarried almost immediately and spent freely on theatrical productions starring his new wife, singer-actress Mabel Taliaferro. By 1912, only 9 years after opening night, Thompson had run through the finances entirely and was forced into bankruptcy. He lost Luna Park to his creditors and retained only a nominal managerial title that he didn't hold for long. A publishing magnate named Baron Collier took over management and kept the park running, but the era of wild invention was over. Luna Park, after 1912, was a version of itself. Still operating, still drawing visitors, but missing whatever made it feel like the future. Thompson moved to San Francisco, where he designed an amusement park called Toyland for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. It never caught fire the way Luna had. He returned to Coney Island in 1916, broke and in poor health. Friends organized a benefit for him that raised $30,000 with the intent of buying him a house. 2 weeks later, he was hospitalized for a kidney disease called Bright's disease. He died on June 6, 1919, at the age of 45. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. He was penniless. His friends took up a collection to pay for a headstone. The man who had built one of the most spectacular public spaces in American history died without $2 to his name. Depression, wartime, and the long fade. After Thompson's death, Luna Park drifted through a succession of owners who kept it open without ever quite figuring out how to make it vital again. The subway reached Coney Island in 1920, which sounds like good news, but was, for Luna Park, quietly catastrophic. The 5-cent fare suddenly made the beach accessible to essentially every New Yorker who wanted to go, and the clientele changed almost overnight. The resort that had drawn well-dressed middle-class families willing to pay $1 for a ticket became what Coney Island was soon called. The Nickel Empire, a place where 1 million people might show up on a summer Saturday, most of them with very little money to spend beyond the train ride. The crowds were enormous. The revenues per visitor shrank. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and made things worse. Luna Park went bankrupt for the first time in 1933 and was foreclosed on by creditors. It kept operating under new management, but the infrastructure was aging, the rides were expensive to maintain, and the money to maintain them wasn't there. The park went bankrupt again before the decade was out. One small bright spot: When the 1939 New York World's Fair closed, a number of its attractions and rides were relocated to Luna Park, temporarily reviving attendance. The park was rebranded the New York World's Fair of 1941 for a season. A new management group took over that year, headed by Milton Sheen and William Miller, hoping to turn the page. Then the war came. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, coastal blackouts were instituted, and Luna Park, whose identity had always been built on its 250,000 blazing electric lights, now had to dim its skyline for the duration. The park that had once been visible for miles across Brooklyn sat dark at night, which was both a literal and a reasonably symbolic description of where it stood. On August 12, 1944, the Dragon's Gorge, one of the original scenic railway rides from Luna Park's first decade, a covered roller coaster featuring elaborate landscapes of canyons and glaciers, caught fire. The cause was never definitively determined. The fire spread and consumed roughly 90% of the park before it was brought under control. The western half was gone. What remained opened briefly in September 1944 for visitors to walk through the ruins. Management charged 10 cents a head for the tour. The park closed permanently that October. The structures that remained were demolished over the following 2 years. By 1958, the Coney Island Housing Project, later renamed Luna Park Houses, had been built over the grounds where 60,000 people had crowded through the gates on a single warm night in 1903 to see what two young men from the Midwest had conjured out of electric light and pure nerve. Influence on the amusement park industry is difficult to overstate. The concept it pioneered, a fully enclosed, thematically designed fantasy world with a unified aesthetic, paid admission at the gate, and a constant rotation of new attractions, became the template for nearly every major amusement park that followed. Dozens of parks around the world borrowed the name directly. Luna Parks opened in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Melbourne, Paris, Buenos Aires, and dozens of other cities. The Australian parks are still operating today. Walt Disney, who opened Disneyland in 1955, has said that early American amusement parks, including Coney Island's parks, were among the formative influences on what he was trying to build, and it is not hard to see Luna Park's DNA in the concept of a walled, carefully designed, thematically immersive fantasy environment separate from the outside world. But it is also worth sitting with the other thing Luna Park was: a place that electrocuted an elephant for publicity before it even opened, charged admission to watch an indigenous tribe perform on demand, and housed a baby ward and a fake disaster show on the same street. A place that was, simultaneously, the most technologically dazzling public space in America and a spectacle powered by the exploitation of animals, people, and infants. All of it dressed up in 250,000 lights and sold to delighted crowds who were thrilled to have a reason to leave the house. It was, in other words, very much a product of its time. Its founders died broke, its buildings burned down, its grounds were paved over for housing. What survived, beyond the name, scattered across 3 continents, was the idea that you could build a world inside a world and charge people to enter it. That idea outlasted everything else. If this video gave you a reason to look sideways at the next theme park you visit, give it a like. It genuinely helps the channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button so you don't miss what we cover next. We'll see you in the next one.